Hey guys, it's Kyle. Welcome to The Nook. I've read a lot of books in my short 32 years. I've honestly forgotten a lot of those same books. Some of them have stuck though, and have sort of come to define my taste. These, in no particular order, just the order they came off my shelf, are 10 of those. Okay, so technically this is going to be 11 books. We're going to start off with an honorable mention, because Sherlock Holmes doesn't necessarily count as one. It's a lot. We're talking about the whole of it. Because when I first read it, I read it from this complete Sherlock Holmes book that my parents had way back when I was still in high school. I read it over the course of an entire summer, and it was really, really good. Sherlock Holmes kind of defines the cozy mystery detective genre. And the stories have staying power for a reason. You don't really need to say much about Sherlock Holmes. Beyond that, each of the mysteries really does come together in a way that is really cool and makes it for a fun reading experience. I don't have a whole lot to say beyond that really, so we're going to jump from him into the other ones because those are the ones that really left an impact and a mark, and they're the ones I really want to talk about. So first on that list is Babel by R.F. Kuang. I first read Babel about 2 years ago, I think, and everyone has been talking about it since, but it is such a great, dark academia book that takes on such challenging topics like colonialism and racism in a way that really challenges you to think about, what you are reading and the lived experiences of others with this. As a straight white male, I don't necessarily feel like the most qualified person to talk on those subjects, but I can say this book is so fantastic and really makes you grapple with the history and the legacy that these two things have through a dark academia, historical, urban fantasy sort of setting. Following up Babel is one that I read in college, and I kept the book because I liked it that much. The Death of Ivan Ilyich and Other Short Stories by Leo Tolstoy. Specifically, I want to talk about The Death of Ivan Ilyich. That was the story that I had to read for class, and it was such a phenomenal read, looking at a man dealing with the impact of his legacy, and more than his legacy, what good he did in the world, and what good he was going to leave behind, and what good he was going to have going forwards as he was dying. That good being the afterlife. The story itself can be talked about in depth, and maybe I will do that in another video once I've honestly done more research. It's been so long since I've read it. But the general crux is, when we are dying and we have looked at the life that we lived, was it worth it for us? How did we live life? Did we live life for ourselves? Did we live life for others? Are we going to be happy with what we have left behind and be able to go calmly into that night? At least that was my takeaway at the time, and it's been my takeaway ever since. It's a deeply moving story, and one that I promise you will not regret reading if you do. Alright, so David Copperfield was a book that I again read many years ago when I was in high school. I actually think I read it at just about the perfect time in my life, because a lot of the things that the character went through in some ways felt reflective for me of things happening in my life at the time. And in many ways, that's why the book is still with me today. The basic crux of the story of David Copperfield is just following a man, David Copperfield, through his whole life from childhood on up. From losing his parents and the life that grows after that, and the love that he finds along the way through that whole cycle of life that is love and loss. The characters feel genuine and real because they don't always make the right decisions. They are immature in many instances, and they grow into learning and understanding themselves and their world as they go, which makes the story even better with time. I've reread it a couple of times as I've gotten older, and it is still just as good as it was when I first read it, if not better, because as you get older, you can kind of see yourself more in the different stages of David Copperfield's life. And that to me is one of the coolest parts of the story, is that I've never read a book before where I saw myself so clearly in the main character in the story, and it is so fun to be able to do that so well. You don't only feel like you're along for the ride, but you feel like you are them, or that you have experienced what they have experienced. And maybe that's just me not experiencing enough of literary fiction, but either way, David Copperfield is very near and dear to my heart for those reasons. Okay, so the next two are considered horror classics in their own rights. One of them I read, I want to say about 5-ish years ago. The other one I read just this past year, and it was the top book for me of the year. But starting with the older of the two, that is Dracula. I don't really know what there is to say about Dracula that hasn't already been said. It's an epistolary story that follows our main characters through the form of their journal entries, which kind of helps to encapsulate the horror of Dracula more, because you're only getting their piece of the puzzle as you go along through the story. You never get the whole picture until you start to get towards the end of the book, when everything starts to come together and the different characters sort of start to come together. It's certainly not the scariest book I've ever read, and if that's something that you're looking for going into it, you may be disappointed, but the horror is still there in its small parts. It is more gothic than it is gruesome, and that's what makes it such a fun read. At least for me anyways. Horror doesn't necessarily always need to be this upfront, the in-your-face sort of dread. It can be lingering and small and in the corners, and sometimes that's even better. But with Dracula, you really just get to feel the breath of the story and the fear that is being felt by the characters. Following that one up, though, is what I read last year, The Exorcist. I read a lot of books that I liked last year, but this was something else entirely. It took me a good minute to really kind of get into it. I wasn't sure about it for the first at least 20 pages. The thing that struck me most in the story being told is that you still get this incredibly strong impression that you aren't 100% sure if what's happening to Regan is real or not. At first it felt very obviously it's real, but the more you read, the more you become convinced that maybe it's not. And I found that to be such a refreshing thing to be done, and really added to the layer and the depth and the horror of what was going on. Ultimately, it turned out to be one of the most poignant things that I read all last year, and it is easily going to be a book that I recommend to everybody in the future, and one that you will 100% be seeing again on this channel. Next up, we dive back into mysteries here with The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. The Moonstone is one of the first sort of detective mystery books that we know of, at least in the English-speaking world. It's even called such on the back of the book. The story follows murder, suicide, and the theft of a large, famous diamond. Next up is a young adult fantasy that I read a couple of years back and was my introduction to what is now one of my favorite authors, V.E. Schwab, and that book is Gallant. I listened to Gallant back in, I want to say 2022, and in many ways that book kind of started my journey of trying to find more things to read, because her writing style, especially in that particular book, was so poetic, so rhythmic. It felt like she was painting with words. After I finished reading it, I just needed to find more, and that's eventually how we ended up here. But the story follows a mute orphan who can see ghouls at an orphanage in London. And while there, one day, she gets a letter saying, hey, your uncle's alive, and he wants to adopt you. And so she gets shipped off to her uncle's estate, and she gets there and finds her cousin, the groundskeeper, and his wife, who basically tell her, your uncle's been dead for years, and we have no idea how you got here. It is this dark, creepy, but still heartwarming story of family that is written with such beautiful prose that at times you'll feel like you're reading poetry. And now, entering the final four, we have Wicked Day, The Wicked Day. This is a book that is part of this Arthurian saga by the author Mary Stewart. This book in particular follows Arthur at the very end of his story with Mordred, while most of the rest of the series follows Arthur through the viewpoint of Merlin. For me, it was one of my first kind of forays into Arthurian legend, into Arthurian saga in a more mature way, and the whole series is just this really fun read that is magical but still grounded in realism, which was not something I had experienced at the time, with a lot of my stuff being very kind of high fantasy, magic, dragons everywhere, as opposed to, a lot more grounded stuff that you find now that is more prevalent nowadays, or seems more prevalent nowadays. I was probably just looking in the wrong places at the time. I mean, I was in middle school. But either way, I've reread it a couple times as an adult, and it still holds up really, really well when you're in a reading slump and you need something to read, but nothing feels quite right. Okay, and then diving away from the world of fantasy and fiction, we have an autobiography? No. A biography of Augustus by Adrian Goldsworthy. I have always been interested in ancient Rome, so I have quite a collection going on back here, as you can see, and this book was one of the big ones for me that really kind of started that collection. It is this deep dive into his life and into the events surrounding his rise to power, and then his consolidation of power, and the peace that followed afterwards. Since that time, I've kind of fallen away from biography as a genre altogether, because it can be very grandiose and self-serving, but it is still, it can still be fun to read, and the stories that we can piece together from people's lives, I think, are still useful for helping us understand history and the way that it's been shaped and has shaped the world we live in. Okay, so with that, we get to the only two that I would say I saved for a particular spot in line, because they are just that good to me. First up is the most recently released book in the Red Rising saga, Lightbringer. So the thing that's most interesting about Pierce Brown and his writing with the Red Rising saga is that with every single book you read, you can see his writing improve. And Lightbringer is absolutely no different. It is by far the best written book in the series, And while I still have, in many ways, a lot of the same criticisms that I do for the other books, which is something that I'm saving for another video coming down the road here, you can see Pierce Brown trying to grapple with a lot of those things in this book and tell a better story with real consequences and characters learning from those consequences. And the things that come about because of that feel so much more earned than what we get in some of the previous books. It was phenomenal, and the only book I have given more than 5 stars. And finally, rounding all of this out, we have my favorite book of all time. I don't think that is ever going to change, The Lord of the Rings. I know, that's not any particularly big thing. That's very vanilla. When I tell people about my journey with reading, I tell them 2 things. Harry Potter got me into reading. Lord of the Rings showed me what reading can be. And I maintain that to this day. It got me not only into fantasy and into trying to read more, but into the idea of trying to write myself. It forever changed the way I view literature on the whole. And the fact that the world that Tolkien built is so incredibly deep, to the point that you can basically spend your life researching it, is just so incredible to me, because no other fantasy series gets quite to that level of depth, at least that I have seen. Maybe I'm wrong. If you know, let me know in the comments. Lord of the Rings is something that I plan on talking about more down the road too. I have ideas for what I could do with that, but suffice to say, it is easily my favorite book of all time. So that's all I've got for today. If you have books that you think should be in this list, let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, like, subscribe, ding the bell, do all of the things, and I'll see you guys next time.